to the first slot, which is a talk, which is called Decolonize the Neoliberal City. Your moderator will be Noa Ha, that you met yesterday, but nobody bothered explaining to you who she is, so I'll try my best. Noa is a PhD student in architecture at the Technical University here in Berlin. Her research focuses on the practices of street lending in the historical district of Berlin, analyzing from decolonial and critical race theory perspective. Deriving from different forms of self-representing, empowering, and anti-racist activisms, her academic work is informed by these theoretical strands, which aims to a decolonizing practice of knowledge production. Until recently, she was a scholar. She was a scholarship holder here at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and was an associate fellow at the Center for Metropolitan Studies in Berlin. She's an active member of Orientation, which is an Asian-German network. Noa.
So welcome. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. Okay, the following talk, we will see if it's more a talk because we will have two presentations, one of Kaneshka and one of Ramón Grosfoguel. So it's more or less classical academic format. And then I will pose some questions, and then we have the possibility to get some questions from you from the audience. So what we saw, what we would need to have a slot on to decolonize the neoliberal city. This talk addresses the imperative of decolonizing the city and why it matters to the Western left in particular. The city has not only been an object of research, but also a place of revolutions, revolts, and social movements. So therefore, the city is a place of political action, but has not been sufficiently addressed as a site of decolonization in Western cities within leftist progressive movements. This is particularly striking for the German context. However, postcolonial immigrants and their children form the informalized and precarized labor army serving the elites of transnational and diverse corporate companies. So the parallelizing of urban society is often addressed as a threat by white politicians, but not considered a daily life experience of non-belonging in public places such as schools, universities, and public spaces, labor markets, or in the media. So through urban design and planning, the city mediates dominant power relations and naturalizes these power relations by materializing them into concrete, territorial, spatial formations of everyday life. The Western left exacerbates and reproduces the colonial implications of city-making by reducing the processes to an economist understanding. So in this way, it disconnects with the struggles of survival unavoidable for postcolonial immigrants and people of color in metropolitan Western cities. So before we start with Kaneshka's talk, I'd like to introduce him. I'm very pleased to have you here. Kaneshka Goonewardena was trained as an architect in Sri Lanka and now teaches urban studies and critical theory at the University of Toronto, where he has been director of the program in planning at the Center for South Asian Studies. His research focuses on urban politics and design, imperialism and nationalism, and critical theory and Marxism. So he's an expert. And his writings have appeared in a variety of scholarly and popular publications such as Antipody, International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Radical History Review, Theory and Demand, Planning Theory, Progressive Planning, Himmel, and Dissenting Dialogues. He co-edited Space, Difference in Everyday Life, reading Henri Lefebvre, and is currently working on a monograph on nationalist ideology in Sri Lanka, and a joint book project with Stefan Kipfer on new critical theoretical approaches to the relationship between urbanization and colonization. We will talk about colonialism and urbanization in critical theory and radical politics. A warm welcome to Kaneshka and The floor is yours.
I want to start by thanking Noa and all the organizers and the volunteers of this truly, truly wonderful conference. I've been going to, all kinds of conferences for over 20 years since I became a PhD student, and I just told Noa in the morning that I cannot really think of one conference where I was so thoroughly engrossed from the first presentation to the last in a single day. And it's going to be a very challenging task for me to, keep up the quality, this experience. And but I will try. The title of my talk is a little bit different from what is in the program. I prefer to call it Urbanization and Colonization in Critical Theory and Radical Politics. And I want to use the words urbanization and colonization rather than colonialism to highlight the contemporaneity of these two processes called urbanization and colonization, as I hope will become clearer. And I also want to, I have written this talk and I want to read it, partly to help with the translators and also to make sure that I don't run out of time, or take too much time. So let me begin with a brief quotation. Wake up! Boom! A battering ram. Boom! A flash grenade. The doors are busting down. The squads in helmets and flak jackets storm through the rooms, shouting for people to get their hands in plain view. Children and grandparents stagger outside, stunned by the onslaught. Young men and women are dragged into the morning light. At 4:30 in the morning, a heavily armed team of 600 officers are storming the units with the force and precision of a military operation. This scene could be from many places in the world: Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, an immigrant suburb of Paris, or as it happens in this case, a neighborhood called Jamestown in Toronto. The incident took place in a small public housing complex of 550 units in a rundown suburb of the city. The quotation is from a popular magazine called Toronto Life. Jamestown was the site of the biggest police raid up to that point in Toronto, one of several such operations conducted in that neighborhood. These invasions were hailed for their military precision by the police chief of Toronto, Will Blair, and as examples of community-based policing by the supposedly social democratic mayor of Toronto at the time, David Miller. Some residents of Jamestown, however, offered different perspectives. According to Hassan Abdidan, I quote, "When I woke up this morning, it looked like a war zone in there." End quote. Much of even the mainstream media concurred with Hassan in this case. Indeed, as my former doctoral student and good friend Amy Siciliano notes in the dissertation on policing poverty in Toronto, Project XXX, as it was known to the cops, was an experience likely familiar to many in Jamestown. Approximately 70% of them come from Somalia. In my collaborative work with Stefan Kipfer at York University, Toronto, we have written about the theory and practice of a phenomenon called herbicide, which has nothing to do with medicinal plants, but everything to do with the killing of cities, which is witnessed with increasing frequency in the post-World War era in the Middle East. I assume that you are familiar with images of armored bulldozers tearing down neighborhoods in Gaza and Israeli soldiers swarming through Jenin, Nablus, and other occupied territories, or scenes of destruction of both urban infrastructure and everyday life in Iraq, Afghanistan, or for that matter, Somalia, the home country of many in the war zone of Jamestown, Toronto. In political terms, herbicide refers to an imperialist urban strategy aimed specifically at destroying the capacity of dominated people to self-organize, resist oppression, and emancipate themselves. Herbicide understood in this sense as demonstrated especially in the works of Israeli architect Eyal Weizman and British geographer Stephen Graham, operates today as a key element of new imperialism and colonialism in a lethal combination of urban planning and warfare. Juxtaposing Jamestown with herbicide in the Middle East provides us with a way into some of the important questions posed in this conference on race, space, urbanism, and the possibilities of resistance to contemporary forms of imperialism and colonialism in a variety of spatial and social contexts around the world. This juxtaposition is not meant in any way to equalize the conditions of Toronto with those of Jenny, August, and neighborhoods. But we do want to highlight here a striking formal similarity between the imperialist political project of herbicide and the clearly racialized and class-based aspect of metropolitan urban policy that we witness in the context of our own comparative research in Toronto and Paris. That is, the destruction of communities of resistance by destroying their spatial, social, and quotidian basis of existence. In other words, herbicide in the Middle East and North American urban policy appear as two variations of a single socio-spatial strategy, especially when viewed from the standpoints of their respective victims who sometimes happen to be closely related, such as the Somalis in Mogadishu and Jamestown. The fact that the colonized peoples of the world and their metropolitan diasporas all too often happen to be the targets of herbicide there and urban policy here obliges us to consider contemporary imperialism and attendant forms of colonization in a global perspective, with due attention to their concerted underlying coherence in spite of their diverse socio-spatial manifestations. The Manichaean compartmentalized world, vividly recalled by Franz Fanon in The Land of the Earth, points to the basic spatial form of this colonial and imperial strategy, still the reality for First Nations peoples and blacks in North America. That is, the physical separation of the dominated from the dominant, which is often complemented by modes of corporeal confinement, legal segregation, and ideological stereotyping characteristic of racialization. From its origins, modern urban planning has been complicit with this kind of fundamentally racialized and class-bound spatiality. For example, Haussmann, the legendary modernizer of Paris from the 1850s to the 1870s, entrusted by Napoleon with the task of securing the capital of France from working-class revolt, followed keenly the advice of Marshal Thomas Robert Bugeaud, who led the notorious French conquest of Algiers in the 1840s and published in 1847 La Guerre des Rues et des Maisons. This appeared in print, as Marx and others were rushing their manuscript to the press, the Communist Manifesto in, late 1847. This is an influential book based on its author's pioneering practices of herbicide in the Kasbahs, which was the first to recommend the radical reformatting of Paris in order to safeguard both imperial and bourgeois rule. Such transfers of urban planning and military technology from Algiers to Paris and back, as brilliantly shown in Guido Ponticovo's film Battle of Algiers, as well as Christine Ross's excellent book Fast Cars, Clean Bodies, continued throughout the 20th century. The spatial separation of social functions has long been a staple of modern urbanism, since zoning became not only the prime legal instrument of city planning, but also a convenient political economic means to segregate people by race and class. This legacy of modern urbanism has been severely criticized, to be sure, sometimes in the name of something called postmodernism. Yet, the neoliberal plans of postmodern urbanism have fared no better than their functionalist modernist predecessors when it comes to the production of colonial and imperial space. In fact, these days the most insidious tactic of what we may call northern or metropolitan herbicide happens to be the opposite of spatial and social segregation. The popular, perhaps even hegemonic method today is called social mix, well known to people in urban planning. Social mix is the official policy under which much urban planning concerning poor people and their neighborhoods happens today in both Toronto and Paris, the cities that Stefan and I studied. The relentless force of decentralization, dispersal, disorganization, and eventual destruction now applied to poor racialized communities in Toronto as much as Paris is most clearly evident to us from corporate-sponsored and paternalist state policies of public housing redevelopment. In southern cities, too, a comparable dynamic can be observed in many slum redevelopment schemes in places such as Mumbai, Rio, and Mexico City. The case in point for us, Stefan and I, in the context of the bourgeoisie of central Toronto, is the redevelopment of Region Park. The opening up of the largest concentration of social housing in Canada to the advantages of the creative class, made possible precisely by changing its social mix in a way that would be simply unimaginable in an even more homogeneous but upscale neighborhood like Grosfoguel, for those of you who know Toronto. Now, Stefan and Jason Pretrudia, his student, has written the definitive case study of what happened to Jamestown. There's a lot of detail there, but I will present the short history of Jamestown in 3 slides. This is the first. Yeah, I think you get the point. In both suburban Toronto, we have the so-called priority neighborhoods, jointly designated by a powerful NGO named United Way and an increasingly neoliberal city planning regime, which are less targets of creative class gentrification than demonized sites of police intervention, the sort witnessed in Jamestown. Yeah, this is a map of Toronto produced by a colleague of mine, David Luchansky at the University of Toronto, showing the social spatial segregation. And in the dark areas, in gray lines in the dark areas, you can see the so-called product neighborhoods like Jamestown, the police is these days, in the official and empowered strategy of the city. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit. And I want to switch gears a little bit, because I'm really as an academic, I do theory, for better or worse, and so let me, to bring the first half of my remarks to a close before turning to some critical comments on contemporary theory, I should point out here the dual character of Euro-American urban policy advocating social mix, which is both hegemonic and coercive, where the creative class is the velvet glove on the iron fist of the police. This differs from the overwhelmingly violent nature of herbicidal practices prosecuted in the imperialist war on so-called terror. Strategies of opposition to different modes of and scales of producing colonial and imperial space, I suggest, must therefore vary according to time and place, depending on concrete circumstances. Groups such as No One is Illegal and the Ontario Coalition of Poverty in Toronto, and Parti des Indigènes de la République and Forum Social et Quartier Populaire in Paris have all highlighted the fundamentally racialized and exploitative dimension of mainstream urban policy and demonstrated the importance of defending poor people's neighborhoods against the forces of gentrification, which never come without displacement and destruction. Against these forces, critical intellectuals have a crucial role to play in exposing the race and class dimensions of the creative city ideology as much as our obsession with austerity. All this should also make it clear that urban questions are only likely to become more urgent and strategic for radical left activists, as the most acute manifestations of contemporary colonialism and imperialism are increasingly concentrated and articulated at the scale and level of our social reality called the urban, not least in varieties of herbicide. Now, just as there exists a variety of forms assumed by contemporary forces of imperialism in their modes of colonization, ranging from herbicide to social mix, so we find a corresponding array of activists fighting against them. The right to the city today serves as a popular slogan that refers broadly to their collective political aspirations in generous and inclusive spirit. In the socialist tradition, it was Henri Lefebvre, the French Marxist philosopher, who first proposed this novel concept in the context of the 60s radicalisms. He, of course, meant the whole idea to be a vital contribution to Marxist thought before it faded into theoretical hinterlands during the peak of neoliberal hegemony in the 80s and the 90s, only to be revived in recent years, though often without much reference to its original revolutionary socialist connotations by various voices ranging from the World Bank and the UN on the one hand to David Harvey and Peter Marcus on the other, as well as by a new generation of radical urban activists, including one coalition in the US called the Right to the City Alliance. The significance of urban space for radical politics has figured strikingly in recent events of world historic significance, not only the ongoing crisis of capitalism, but also the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring, even, or especially as their trajectories remain to be worked out. We are familiar, for example, with the urban roots of the financial crisis, as Harvey in particular has explained it in his latest writings. Mike Davis, in a utopian note on the Occupy movement, registers the importance of streets and squares for the 99%, commenting on the existential identification of Zuccotti Park occupiers with the homeless, and highlighting how encounters in urban space continue to be vital for radical democracy and social struggle, in spite of the increasing influence of new social media. Likewise, writing in the Arab English publication Jad al-Liga, Dean Sharp underlines what urban development in Cairo from the last days of Sadat to those of Mubarak had to do with the famous scenes in Tahrir Square that surprised many in the West. Even in mainstream media, some were quick to see in these events an essential connection between urban space and radical politics. Michael Timmerman, the architecture critic of New York Times, observed in an opinion piece the political power of urban space, recalling, much like Davis, the durable centrality of the city to the development of democracy, in his view, from Aristotle's time to ours. Such reflections are to be welcomed, surely, by those of us concerned with progressive developments in radical left politics, as we continue to think through the nexus of the urban and the revolution, or the urban revolution, as Lefebvre suggestively put it. Yet, here we must also note at once that not everyone waving the banner of the right to the city today is equally concerned with the revolution as Lefebvre was. Nor does everyone in this motley crew adequately acknowledge the actuality of colonization. While we can recognize in groups like these nuanced reflections on the urban dimensions of colonization, which are impossible without coming to terms with the legacies and realities of race, such conceptions are still quite undeveloped, as Noa noted in the introduction, among many other urban critics and activists, for whom the problem of colonization exists, if at all, as a marginal rather than central issue of contemporary urbanization. This uneven development of the consciousness of colonization, which is to be found in the South as much as the North, now presents a pressing problem for anyone who wishes to work through the relationship between radical left politics and urban politics in a revolutionary rather than a provincial way. Now, the reasons for this problem do not lie entirely in the persistent Eurocentrism of much metropolitan thought, as noted by Edward Said in Orientalism, or in the kinds of racism that operate even in progressive political milieux, as documented in Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism and Ward Churchill's A Little Matter of Genocide. Although Eurocentrism and racism still present the most formidable obstacles to the development of a historicized consciousness of colonization, as demonstrated also in the Italian Hegelian Marxist Domenico Losurdo's remarkable work, Liberalism, Account of History, which theorizes American democracy as basically master-race democracy. Concerning the prevailing under-theorization of colonization in the discourses with which we routinely engage, we must also address at least two more related factors. First, the peculiar relationship between Marxism and urban studies. And second, the limitations of the dominant strands of postcolonial theory and subaltern studies, which underpin what Ananya Roy and others call subaltern urbanism. To conclude, let me be brutally brief in my comments on this. At the risk of being reductive and also perhaps annoying a few comrades, I may say that Marxism's affair with the city has been casual, if consummated. Its best moment is still to be found in the condition of the working class in England in 1844, where the 23-year-old Friedrich Engels discovers Marxism in and by means of the city, even before properly meeting Marx. I have argued elsewhere that Engels' enlightenment in Manchester is truly remarkable because in discovering a new socio-spatial reality triangulated by bourgeois social relations, industrial technology, and unprecedented urbanization, and assessing the prospects of proletarians within it, he had the good sense in that situation to not make an artificial distinction between urban struggle, living conditions on the one hand, and class struggle, working conditions on the other hand, on the way to socialism. This natural unity of urban and class struggles was seen most paradigmatically by Marx and Engels, and later Lefebvre and Debord in the Paris Commune, in Arabia, in the street of the Paris Commune here. It's an important example, particularly for Lefebvre and Debord, who asked the question, why is the Paris Commune only thought of as a social revolution, and not also as an urban revolution? But this natural unity of urban struggle and class struggle has been largely ignored for much of the last century in the mainstreams of both socialism and urbanism. The organized working class focused on the factory, as experts of all times took over matters of the city into their own corporate professional hands, separating critical urban struggles from radical socialist movements, to the detriment of arguably all emancipatory politics. There are, of course, honorable exceptions to this general trend to exclude the revolution from the city and the city from the revolution. In exemplary moments of urban modernism, an architect like me and Noa, like in Red Vienna and so on, or in the writings of cultural critics like Walt Benjamin and Raymond Williams. Even much of the exceptional canon of what Andy Merrifield calls metro-Marxism still suffers, however, from what we might term metrocentrism. That is, the often self-serving reluctance of Western and other privileged modes of thought fully to examine their own conditions of possibility. This is one central weakness of metro-Marxism that has been forcefully called into question by scholars such as Jennifer Robinson in Ordinary Cities and Abdul Simoon in City Life from Dakar to Jakarta, who make the excellent case for a more profound engagement with southern cities in the making of critical urban theory. But even their salutary efforts in the name of southern or suburban urbanism fail, in my view, to deal adequately with the problem of colonization as such, not least because of their reliance on certain cultural nationalist motives of postcolonial theory and suburban studies, which have been a bit too preoccupied with Dinesh Chakravarty's seductive call to provincialize Europe, and therefore prone also to the temptation of a certain kind of Orientalism in reverse, while being unable to escape fully the us versus them binary and draw new lines of struggle appropriate to the contemporary rescaling of global, spatial and social realities. As Roy herself notes in a few elegant and influential essays, subaltern urbanism has been concerned above all to respond to the metro-Marxist habit of depicting the southern city as a pathological space, as a planet of slums. To quote Mike Bates's famous words that Roy finds unpalatable. With theoretical resources borrowed from Deleuze as much as Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian neoliberal, subaltern urbanists have therefore rallied energetically to the cause of proving that the proverbial slum is not at all as bad as it is rumored to be by a few Western radicals, but actually quite an entrepreneurial and creative place, where ordinary people strive to improve their lives just as capably as anywhere else. In celebrating vividly what has been denigrated as slum, these writers have certainly succeeded. The obsession with repudiating metro-Marxism, however, seems to have diverted their energy away from another task, The task of explicating how forces of imperialism and colonization now operate in the south as well as the north, and which is an essential task and an essential prerequisite for articulating new forms of urban struggle with radical politics. In our own approach to this task, Stefan Kipfer and I are concerned not to reject Marxism but to enrich it. And in the spirit of this conference, we may even say to decolonize Marxism. Why not? To a point where provincial labels such as Western Marxism and Metro Marxism would lose their relevance. Here we follow closely the good advice of Ramón, who said that Marxism had to be stretched in order to be actual in colonial conditions, while also warning very accurately against what he called the pitfalls of national consciousness. That is, the unsavory consequences of the tendency of anti-colonial struggles to embrace nationalism at the expense of socialism, thereby leaving intact the basic structures of colonial socio-spatial relations. This is the phenomenon who is repressed in the cultural nationalist modes of post-colonial theory and virtually absent from subaltern urbanism, but the one who guides our engagement with these schools of thought in order to pursue a more historical materialist approach to the contemporaneity of colonization. Now, what would such an approach be? The central basic requirement is perhaps all too evident, which is the demonstration of the actuality of colonization in a so-called post-colonial world in order to inject an anti-colonial dimension to radical politics today. Such a demonstration, in our view, calls for nothing short of a new conception of colonization, which can no longer be restricted to mean the political relations established at the scale of the nation's state by classical European imperialism. The persistence of imperialism after decolonization, even if ever more economic than political in the officially post-colonial world of globalization and postmodernism, still requires the continuous production and reproduction of unequal territorial relations at several spatial scales, including those above and beyond the national, especially the urban. This is the context in which we can appreciate the redefinition of colonization proposed by Lefebvre in his books on the scale. That is, let me quote, wherever a dominated space is generated and mastered by a dominant space, where there is periphery and center, there is colonization. Yet, we must also, I'm pretty close to the end, yet we must also take care not to allow colonization to mean just about any kind of unequal relation. Even a spatially nuanced and properly rescaled concept of colonization can acquire specificity and retain legitimacy only by acknowledging the historical realities of colonialism and the spatial political forms in which they still persist along with imperialism. This is why Stefan and I have argued that it is necessary to qualify and supplement Lefebvre and others in the Metro-Marxist tradition by the critical phenomenological sensibilities of Fanon and some contemporary anti-racist critics, whose accounts of the everyday lived experiences of colonial space we find invaluable. The range of situations to which the kind of new concept of colonization that we are calling for could apply will be broad but not unlimited. They will surely include, to take an example from our own work, the struggles around public housing in Toronto and Paris, where the viability of immigrant neighborhoods such as Jamestown is now at stake. Just as relevant, certainly in secular colonial societies such as Canada, will be the living conditions of native peoples, which recall the territoriality of classical colonialism. And acknowledging the powerful works of both Angela Davis and Lucy Gilmore on the mass incarceration of black people in the US, I want to ask, is it possible to make sense of this appalling phenomenon without some reference to colonization? A famous socialist who debated political strategy with Rosa Luxemburg almost 100 years ago once said that there is no revolutionary politics without revolutionary theory. That is the spirit in which a new concept of colonization is now needed. To produce such a concept, we have to not only break out of Western Marxism and Metro Marxism, but also go beyond postcolonial theory and subaltern studies. The latter need is now asserted even by the superstars of these discourses. Gayatri Chakravarti's Quebec betrays the inadequacy of their concept of colonialism when, on the first page of her critique of postcolonial reason, she accuses postcolonial studies of, quote, unwittingly commemorating a lost object. In similar vein, an obituary appeared earlier this month in the Mumbai-based Economic and Political Weekly, written by Partho Chatterjee, the founding father of the Subaltern Studies Collective. Announcing the death of Subaltern Studies, there he says that the world has changed more than it could handle. In his own words, quote, Subaltern Studies was a product of its time. Another time calls for other projects, end quote. I think even Lenin would agree with that.
Thank you very much, Kaneshka. Now we will go over to the presentation of Ramón Grosfoguel. He came all the way from Berkeley here. He's professor at the Ethnic Studies Department of the University of California at Berkeley and senior research associate of the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris. And he has published extensively on questions of racism, Islamophobia, Caribbean migration, and political economy of the world system, as well as decolonial thinking and theory. So he is going to present here on white cities, multiculturalism, and the Westernized left paradigms of urban political economy. Welcome to Ramón.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Ana Jones, Andrea Torres, Noa Ha, Madis Asarmandi, and Nika Slavodsky for having organized this such a wonderful space for conversations. I remember being a year ago here in Berlin and talking to Noa. Noa has this idea in her mind without a single penny, without a single anything, and look where we are. You know, it's amazing what you have done, you know, in creating this space. So let me first say that I think it would be a very interesting conversation because I agree with everything you said, but maybe we're using different language, and that's okay because I think that decolonization cannot have a single language. If we pretend to think about decolonization from a single language, then we're going to repeat once again the Western-centric, Eurocentric paradigm where you can only think critically from only one traditional thought. And so I think it's this possibility of having different genealogies of thought and different language to talk about the same thing and coming from different experiences, I think is very important for a decolonial project because there cannot be any more a universal, that is one that defines for the rest, and impose its vision on the others. I think we have to think in terms of how there are diverse experience of imperialism, colonization, there are diverse epistemologies in the world, and there's going to be also different language and perspective to think about decolonization from different spaces. So I welcome this conversation. I want to focus on the question, first I want to discuss the question of paradigms of political economy, because I think that part of what happened is that the paradigms of political economy, Western-centric or Eurocentric paradigms of political economy, were taking as a point of departure the social historical experience of the European proletariat, or of northern-centric processes of capitalist accumulation, many times, and they have very important insights. It's not that in the process of decolonization we're throwing away, the critical thinking produced from the global north. That would be like stupid if we do that. And I agree with your take that you're building, taking critical insights at the same time that are criticizing some of these authors without throwing away their good insights and critiques. And so, so I think that in terms of paradigms of political economy, they're centered fundamentally on the concept of capital accumulation and fundamentally on the concept of class and labor, privileging labor. And so what happened is that these paradigms are used also in urban political economy. Because in urban political economy, you have the extrapolation of some of these paradigms into the understanding of urban relations, urban processes. And you could see, for example, the work of Saskia Sassen, The Global City, where she looks at global networks of financial capital and how global cities serve as spaces of management and control of global capital flows. You could see the work of Harvey, where he looks at process of capital accumulation and understand the process, the urban processes in relation to those processes. You could see the work of Neil Smith, the question about gentrification and how he looks at it from the question of also capital accumulation and class. Now, all of these authors have brought very important critical insights into those processes. But at the same time, I think that for a decolonial process, we need to think about how to decolonize the paradigms of political economy. And to decolonize the paradigm of political economy doesn't mean throwing away some of the good insights coming from the scholars working within the most traditional Marxist, in the most Western-centric way. Okay, and I think part of what happened is that in privileging class, capital accumulation, and labor, then when all of them, I mean, I know some of them, and I can tell you that they will be the first ones on the line to criticize racism, sexism, etc. So, but in terms of articulating, theoretically, the articulation between class, race, sexuality, gender, I would say that they have a lot of difficulties. Okay? Because in privileging class, labor, capital accumulation, then what happens is that when you start talking about race, gender, sexuality, and other forms of oppression, there are all these difficulties in how you go about putting the whole thing together. And part of what happens usually is that either these paradigms of political economy look at race, gender, sexuality, etc. as some kind of derivative from class, economic relations, etc., or as a superstructure in some cases, in the most orthodox ways, but it's always as something supplementary to the central question, which is labor, class, economy, capital accumulation. You see, and so what I'm going to try to do here is present an alternative that I've been working for a long time, which is decolonizing political economy. And I think that there is a long tradition of work already done on this question. You could see that in the Black Marxist tradition of that, okay, where you have many names there, and I highly recommend the book Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. You could see also in the tradition of Latin American thinkers, mestizo, indigenous thinkers in Latin America, like Mariátegui, that the question of race was a fundamental question and had difficulties in his conversation in the 1920s with the old Soviet bloc because the communist movement was privileging class and they saw him as some kind of, in the language of the time, revisionist or whatever. And there was all these conflicts with Mariátegui. where Mariana was saying, I cannot understand the reality of Peru only with class, because in Peru, 80% of the labor force are peasants, but it's not only that they're peasants, it's that they're indigenous people. And therefore, I have to bring race in a central way in the understanding of class. Okay? So it's not anymore that race is epiphenomenal, derivative, superstructural of class, economy, etc. Is that race is an organizing principle of the political economy. And so there is a huge literature that, you know, that is there. So in that sense, we don't need to discover the Mediterranean, okay? You know, we don't need to discover the It's already, a lot of this work is already done, you know? Part of what happened is that because of epistemic racism, sexism, we don't have access to this material, or it's always thrown away and nobody takes it seriously. You know, this is it. You know, so you have epistemic racism, sexism at work in invisibilizing, silencing this critical tradition of people of color from all over the world that are looking at the world from a different location and producing different theory from the traditional Marxists. And so you could say there is a decolonial Marxism going on for a long time. Now, you could say also that there are critical traditions of thought that are not only Marxist, that also kind of are tangential to Marxism, but come from other traditions. You know, like, for example, the work of Ali Shariati from Islam, that you could say this is a kind of a decolonial critical thinking, and he dialogues with Marxism, existentialism, and other traditions, but he's centering his critical thought from Shia Islam, and brings in a lot of very interesting perspective, concepts, etc. So, and we could see the same thing with indigenous people, aboriginal people in other parts of the world, where they have a critical tradition of thought that is not centered necessarily in the Western critical tradition of thought. Okay, so that is there, and it's been there for a long time. It's just that because of epistemic racism, sexism is invisibilized, not only in Western academia, the Westernized university, you know, but it's also invisibilized in the Westernized left. And I didn't say Western university or Western left, I say Westernized. Because Westernized university is a structure of global power that exists not only in Berlin, Paris, New York, or Berkeley, it exists also in many parts of the world of the global south. You know, where you see in those universities the reproduction, again, of epistemic sexism, racism, you know, once again, and every department you go in the social science and humanities, you have to read the same white guys of these 5 countries, Germany, Italy, France, England, and the USA. And this is the canon of thought, and this is what is called scientific social theory, and this is what is called critical theory. And the Westernized left reproduce the same thing. Whatever it is, the Westernized left in Chile or in Senegal, or the Westernized left, this is a colonial project from the left. And so, and the Westernized university, wherever it is the same thing. So, there is a silencing, visibilization of all these other rich tradition, critical tradition. So, I would say that if we take seriously the question of race and racism as an organizing principle of the political economy, of the international division of labor, of different power relations, then we have a different picture. So one of the language used in Latin America to talk about this is the concept of coloniality. Coloniality as opposed to colonialism. Coloniality to refer basically to colonialism. Coloniality depends on European colonial expansion and on colonialism, but it's not reducible to it. Coloniality are all those forms of power relation that emerge, hierarchies of power at a global scale that emerge as part of the European colonial expansion and the formation of colonialism in many parts of the world. So the condition possibility for colonialism is colonialism. But once you have coloniality emerging, it acquires an autonomy from the presence of the colonial administration. That means that those global hierarchies of power put forward by the history of colonialism, okay, is what I will be calling coloniality. Okay? And those hierarchies of power are, the organizing principle is the racial ethnic hierarchy and the question of racism. So if we look, for example, in that sense, to do that, we need a shift in the geography of reason towards a different body politics and geopolitics of knowledge. That is, we need to, in a sense, displace the location from where we're thinking to be able then to produce a different political economy. And I'm saying we need to rescue the space of political economy, because right now the space of political economy has been, in a sense, quote-unquote, kidnapped, okay, by this Western-centric Marxism, you see? And we need to, in a sense, intervene in those spaces to bring a different perspective, because it's important in terms of the cartography of power for political struggles of decolonization. So let me say very fast and briefly that for me, the cartography of power includes, I have identified 15 global hierarchies of power, okay, 15. I'm sure that if you do the same exercise, you will find others that I haven't thought about, okay? So I have thought of, there is an international division of labor, okay, of core periphery, going on since 1492, like Ella was telling us yesterday. There is a global interstate system, okay, of political military organization of core states with political military power over peripheral states. Okay? I'm mentioning like this in a sequence, but this is all entangled. We cannot think about this with the old notion of the last instance of the Marxists, and we need to think about this as an entanglement, as intersectionality, as a heterarchy. I'm going to talk more about that. But there is a global racial hierarchy of the West and the rest, and whoever is defined as the West is considered superior, whoever is defined as the rest is, or non-Western, is considered inferior, and the dividing line there is the line of the human. There is a Christian patriarchal system that is the one that got globalized, and that in many places produce global hierarchies of power that are gender hierarchies and sexual hierarchies. And those hierarchies, we need to understand them we need to historicize that, because in many parts of the world, there were spaces in the world before 1492 in which there were non-Western forms of patriarchy, and European colonization either destroyed those non-Western forms or did complicity with them without destroying them, you see, and or there was some hybridity between the Christian form of patriarchy and the local ones, okay? So we need to look concretely how these things have developed over time. The same thing with the question of sexuality. So there are places where the Christian patriarchy imposed the form of Christian, homophobia, and in other places there was some complicity with local form. In other places, you got hybrid. So this thing we need to look at in the concrete history of the local history of colonization, imperialism, etc. Now, I will talk about a Christian-centric hierarchy, patriarchal hierarchy, because it's the one that got globalized. That doesn't mean there's no other forms of patriarchy, okay? But the one that got globalized was this one, and we need to look completely how this articulated with other forms. There is also an epistemic hierarchy, in which you have, again, Eurocentric knowledge being privileged and superior over non-European, non-Western knowledges, or epistemologies, or cosmologies, or ways of thinking. And that's, all these hierarchies I'm mentioning have their own discourses, their own institutions. Okay? You could see in the International Division of Labor, transnational corporation. You will see the formation in the interstate system of the structure of the nation state as the quintessential form of political authority, as if there was no other possibility, or as if there were no other possibilities in the past, the present, and the future. Okay? And we know all the problems that nation states have created, and it's a colonial tool of domination everywhere it exists. We could see in the patriarchal, Christian patriarchal hierarchy, the concept of the family, the concept of monogamous family, heteronormativity, etc. You know, so we could see in the epistemic hierarchy the Westernized university as a global structure of power, without which the division of labor won't work, because it's the structure that forms the third world, the Westernized third world elites that are going to be instrumental to the process of capital accumulation on a world scale. You have also linguistic hierarchies in which European language are privileged over non-European languages. You have aesthetic hierarchies where forms of beautiness and taste, etc., of Western forms are considered superior over non-Western form, and so you have primitive art, naive art, and so on. You know that all these racist terms to talk about art in the non-West. So you have hierarchies of ecological hierarchies. There are spaces of the world that are the garbage of the world. Okay, there are big spaces of the world that are eco-fascist spaces. Okay, you have so ecology in itself is not enough. Okay, because ecological notion could be also very, very colonial, imperialist, and even fascist. Okay, because it's constructed on the shoulders of having other places as the garbage. Okay, so there are hierarchies, pedagogical hierarchies in the world, where the Cartesian form of pedagogy is privileged over other forms, other so-called non-Western forms of pedagogy. There are, in my work, I identify 15. I'm sure you will identify many others. But the point is, we cannot think about these hierarchies as separate from each other, but as entangled in the sense of heterarchies. That is, the articulation of multiple hierarchies in complex ways. There's no last instance here, like the Marxists would like, and there's no separate spheres of reality like the Barbarians would love. Okay? This is more complex. You cannot understand any of them without the others. At the same time that you cannot reduce all the others into one. Okay, so it's a notion of complexity here, and it's not an accident that those concepts of complexity, entanglement, and so on are coming precisely from thinkers of the global south, like intersectionality is a concept of black feminists, Chicana feminists, like heterarchy is a concept developed in Latin America, in places like Asia and other places. The concept of heterogeneous historical structures is another concept to talk about the same thing, about articulating things in complex way, developed by Aníbal Quijano, the author of Decolonialism of Power. So all these hierarchies of power form what Quijano called the coloniality of power. Okay? It's coloniality because if you watch carefully, each hierarchy is organized along racial lines of the West and the West. Okay? At a global scale. With manifestation, particular manifestation in regional, local, national levels. So I agree with you about the scale in terms of space and geography that is fundamental to keep in mind as a constitutive force to understand also the diversity of the way these hierarchies of power get articulated in different ways in different spaces of the world. So instead of going to a space of the world thinking, okay, the last instance is the economy, okay, and I'm going there to find the last instance, okay, we have to keep an open mind there to look at how these things articulate historically as part of the local colonial imperial history. Everywhere, not just in the periphery of the world economy, but at the core, you know, here in Berlin, etc., you know. So, so in that sense, I would say that, you know, again, the part of the problem and difficulties of this conversation that I see everywhere everywhere we have these kind of discussions is the question of epistemic racism and sexism. That becomes, I'm calling it epistemic racism and sexism because in the Western tradition of thought, there is the privilege of white males of 5 countries. you know, the 5 countries I mentioned. And they form the canon, okay, of the Westernized university and the Westernized left. And so in doing that, what happens is that you get social historical experiences of other subjects in the world that become completely you know, erased. So I refuse to keep talking about global capitalism or capitalist world system and name the system we live this way. Because the moment you use this language, in the common sense, immediately remits us into the question of the economy as the main problem. And we know the consequences of that kind of thinking in 20th century socialism. That in privileging that, they thought that in resolving the class capital question, they would resolve the rest. In fact, they not only did not resolve the rest, but that the way they deal with the question of capital itself ended up corrupted. Because if you organize against capital in racist way, in heterosexist way, in sexist way, in Eurocentric ways, in, I forgot, other hierarchy of power, the religious hierarchy of power, where you have the Christian religion becoming the hegemonic religion and the rest becoming inferiorized relative to Christianity. Okay? And you have the church there, Protestant and Catholic, becoming a global institution. Okay? So I would say all these hierarchy of power form an integral part of the political economy of the system. We cannot keep talking about political economy without bringing into the conversation all these other hierarchies of power. And that's what I call decolonizing the paradigm of political economy, that they will only like to talk in a mono language about class, economy, capital accumulation. What I want to say is that you cannot understand class, economy, capital accumulation if you don't understand the previous constitutive organizing force of all these other hierarchies of power, okay, inside what we call the economy, so-called economy. That's why the notion of entanglement, intersectionality, heterarchies is a more useful concept, because it put us to think about complexity and how there's no frontiers between these things, and how the force of patriarchy, force of race, are organizing principles of class. So instead of looking at class or race as the derivative, we have to turn around the thing and look about how we need to change the way we talk about class, economy, and capital accumulation. Because then we need to bring in all these other questions of hierarchies of power that form part of this system we live. So I refuse to keep talking about a capitalist system or global capitalism. I prefer, at the risk of sounding ridiculous, to use a long phrase. I prefer to naming is important. I prefer to name it differently. I prefer to call it capitalist / patriarchal, Western-centric / Christian-centric, modern / colonial world system. And I prefer to use a long phrase like this, at the risk of sounding ridiculous, in order to put on the table all the hierarchies of power that are at stake, instead of keeping the old language of capital accumulation, capitalist system, global capitalism, capital world system. We need to change the language, because otherwise we're never going to be heard. Because we're going to be using a language that is already trapped by Eurocentric thinking. It's already kidnapped by Eurocentric thinking. And so we need to use a different language here to talk about all these other things invisibilized in the paradigms of political economy. And so for me, decolonizing the paradigm of political economy will involve not only a different naming, but a different identification of a multiplicity of power relations that are part of the political economy, and that those paradigms of political economy that are Western-centric hegemonic have thrown to the side. Okay? And the best of them will just recognize, you know, because if not, they will be accused of sexist or racist, and they say, oh yeah, here is racist or here, but it's always never fit well into their conceptual apparatus. It's always like they're, you know, like in a clumsy way inside the apparatus they form theoretically. So I would say that then we need to think about a decolonial urban political economy. That is, we need then to think about how is it that in the political economy of the urban spaces, you have there the entanglement of these multiplicity of power relations, okay? And that's why you cannot understand gentrification just based on capital regulation. You need to bring in the question of race, the question of gender, other questions there are constitutive of capital regulation from within, okay? So, I would like to talk about cities as microcosms of empire, okay? Cities as microcosms of empire, in which you see the traces of colonial history, okay? The colonialism of power being put forward there, okay, in the spaces of the city. The racial hierarchies, okay, the patriarchal hierarchies, the linguistic hierarchy, epistemic hierarchies, the core periphery hierarchy, the division of labor, no? The way the state and the so-called nation state operates, okay, and so on. I mean, we need to look at the articulation of all of these dimensions. Aesthetics, the way aesthetics operate in the city, okay, in the Western century. So we need to bring, in that sense, a different, a decolonial political economy to then decolonize the urban paradigms of political economy. This is the way I think about this. So I would say we need to see cities as microcosms of empire. We need to see cities as spaces of colonial encounter, because in those spaces you see the articulation, the relationality between histories that have a long durée, you know, in terms of that between the colonized and colonized, that as you well presented today, you see these things happening in urban spaces today. And I would like to end with the concept of racism of Fanon. I would like to end with this concept. If you examine carefully in Fanon, you have in Fanon, this is important for the question of decolonizing the political economy. I think in Fanon, he talks about racism, always institutional. That was discussed yesterday extensively by Stella, by Ella Choha. And so I think that I don't need to go into that. I'm not going to go into those details. Racism is always institutional, very clear in Fanon. But the question for Fanon is that racism is a structure of power and domination along the line of the human, in which you have whoever is above the line is considered a superior being, whoever is below the line is considered an inferior being. That means that whoever is above the line is considered, their humanity is recognized, is considered human. Whoever is below, their humanity is not recognized, is considered subhuman, and is or non-human. Okay? And for Fanon, he will talk about this zone as the zone of being. He called it the zone of being, where he will say that because the humanity of the people in this zone is recognized, you have here the recognition of the ways of thinking, epistemologies, spiritualities, ways of living, etc. of the people in this zone. Okay? While the people in this zone are living, according to Fanon, in the zone of non-being. Okay? He uses this term, being non-being, basically in a critical dialogue with the phenomenological tradition, Sartre, Heidegger, etc. Because for Heidegger, the question is that Western philosophy forgot the question of being. And Fanon responds to that by saying, the problem is not the forgetfulness of the zone of being. The problem is the forgetfulness of the zone of non-being. The problem is how the people who are in this zone their humanity is not recognized, they're dehumanized. And therefore, what happened here is that the ways of living, their epistemologies, their ways of thinking, the ways of relating, their spiritualities, etc., is considered inferior relative to the people in this zone. And this is a development done by Afro-Caribbean philosophers, Fanonian Afro-Caribbean philosophers, of this question of Fanon in black skin, white mask. Now, the problem here, and this is where it becomes complicated, is that the way the system, and this is the question of violence coming in, the way the system regulates conflict or manages conflicts in this zone because this zone is not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous. There is an I-other dialectic here in the zone of being, in which this other is an oppressed other in the zone of being. There are people in the zone of being that are oppressed along class, gender, sexuality, religiosity, whatever. What is common to the people in the zone of being is that they live racial privilege. They are not oppressed along racial lines. They live racial privilege. And in that sense, you have here, in this other, in the zone of being, is an oppressed, but it's an oppressed that relative to the people in the zone of being, because they live racial privilege, the way the system manages the conflicts here is very differently. And here I bring some concepts that are Fanonian but developed by the European decolonial sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, where he talks about this line. He will say that the way the system manages conflict is through regulation and emancipation. That means that people, the regulation here means that there are codes of law, human rights, labor rights, women's rights, etc., that are recognized in this zone. And so the conflicts are managed through process of regulation, codes of law, and emancipatory discourses, like equality, okay, like, enlightenment discourses of equality, of equal, women's equality, labor equality, etc., okay? Fraternity equality, liberty, freedom, etc., autonomy. And so, in that sense, in this zone, conflicts are, as a trend, fundamentally managed through peaceful means, with exceptional moments of violence. With exceptional moments of violence. It's not that there's zero violence, there are moments of violence here, but it's not the rule. Okay? It's an exception that confirms the rule. While in the zone of being, because the humanity of the subjects in this zone, okay, is not recognized, then here, the way the system manages conflict is through violence and appropriation, or dispossession. Okay? And so in this area, so you have here process of capitalist accumulation, if you want to use the term of capitalism or class, and here in which you have, I don't know to say the term in English, but it's acumulación ampliada de capital. It's a term used by Marx. Acumulación ampliada de capital. Thank you. So, and here you have accumulation by dispossession. Okay? Here you have accumulation by dispossession in the zone of being. So the thing is that you have violence and appropriation as a norm of the way the system manages conflicts. Okay? With exceptional moments of peace. Okay? So you see the inversion. Now, there are people oppressed on class lines here as well as here. But there is a huge difference the way the system managed class exploitation here or here. And I'm saying this just to show an example of how class is not enough. Okay? How class is not enough. Because here, let's say you have workers in the Airbus company in South France, for example, earning 125, 150 euros a day? No, an hour. Okay? An hour. Working 8 hours a day. They have conflicts with this side. This is the capitalist, imperial, masculinist, heterosexual elites, okay? Westernized elites, okay? This side, okay? And they have conflicts. There are conflicts there. And they have class conflict. But then they can go to a demonstration. They can go and fight, go on strike. Go and fight the corporate capitalists in the court. But they know that in doing that, their life is not at stake, okay? Which is very different from spaces in the cities of the global north or labor in the global north that comes from the zone of being racialized people, okay, who live below the line of the human in cities or in the global south, okay, like a maquiladora worker, which 90% are women of color in the world. Okay? okay? Where they work 14, 16 hours a day, they earn $2 an hour? No, a day, okay? A day. And they know that if they try to organize a union, or if they don't strike, or they go and do a demonstration, their life is at risk. Their life is at risk. Because the way the system manages conflict there is through violence. And they know that they could be shot in doing that, okay? They could be killed in doing that. So here you have an example of how you cannot say this is a proletariat exploited, you know, and this one proletariat exploited and proletariat of the world unite, okay? There's more here into the question that cannot be collapsed using these abstract universals. And the same thing you could say about gender oppression. And this is what black feminists and Islamic feminists, indigenous feminists, Chicana feminists have been calling for. That you can also not understand the way the system practice gender domination in this zone, because in this zone they live racial privilege. But in this zone, gender domination is aggravated by racial domination, okay? And therefore, you need to put this line there, not to say that race is the only thing that matters. That's not what I'm saying, please, okay? I'm saying we need to bring intersectionality in each zone, okay? But analytically, okay, analytically speaking, we need to previously know in which zone is class operation happening. In which zone is gender oppression happening? You see, in which zone is sexual oppression happening? In which zone is religious oppression happening? To understand the living experience of the people in both zones, and part of the misunderstanding, I wrap up here, part of the misunderstanding here is that a lot of what we have eat or drink as critical theory and as social scientific theory and so on is based on the social historical experience of the other in the zone of being, okay? And what happened is that if they will tell me, listen, I developed this theory based on my experience as an oppressed, okay, in class, gender, and sexuality in this zone, and I recognize I live racial privilege, okay, and I don't pretend that my theory will explain this, that's fine. But the problem is that what happened is the universalism that Ella was speaking yesterday, that they will write this with the same pretension of universality of this I. And they will try to say that their theories are the ones that are going to explain everything that happened here. And so that's where we start the clash, okay? Because, and the complete misunderstanding is here. Because the problem is that this theoretical framework built upon the social historical experience of an oppressed in the zone of being do not have the categories to understand what it means to live class, gender, sexual oppression aggravated by racial oppression. For that you need other categories and other thinkers. Okay? Thinkers of color that have theorized that. There's a lot of work on this. Okay? The problem is that because of epistemic sexism, racism, they are invisibilized, okay? But the work, the body of work is there, okay? And the point is that there is a kind of colonization from the Western left and a colonization from the Westernized university, etc., in the pretension of thinking that the theories built upon the social historical experience of the other oppressed in the zone of being is going to exhaust all the experience of oppression in the world, and it's going to give you all the tools you need to understand all the oppressions in the world. And therefore, all you need to do is keep reading those white guys here, okay? And that's it. With that is enough, okay? But the project decolonization have to be highly critical of this, okay? And have to take seriously, as a point of departure, the critical thinking produced from the zone of non-being. And the zone of non-being, and I want to finish with this, is not only north-south in the international division of labor, etc. It's also, there is a zone of being non-being inside the north, and there's a zone of being non-being inside the south. Okay? There is a north in the south, and there is a south in the north. And there's zones of being and non-being in Berlin, in Paris, New York, Los Angeles, etc. Okay? And this is, I think, the fundamental point that I think Fanon brings to the conversation, to think about intersectionality, but tell me first, which zone of the world is this happening, to then understand what are you talking about. Part of what happens is that we don't make these distinctions, and then we collapse whatever oppression exists everywhere as if it was the same. And it's not the same. And that's why you have an Islamic feminist, that's why you have black feminists, Chicana feminists, indigenous feminists, responding to Westernized feminism that are thinking from the experience of another oppressed in the zone of being, and theorizing from there. But those theories cannot account for what is lived by an indigenous woman, what is lived by an Islamic woman, what is lived by a black woman. Okay? So just to give an example with feminism, we could do the same with the Westernized left, okay, in terms of class, in terms of many issues. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for you, to you both, to those two very inspiring talks. I had an idea yesterday what I'd like to ask you today, but throughout your two presentations I came up with a different question which I'd like to pose, and I would like to come back to the title of Decolonize the Neoliberal City. And I would like to question from where we embark to which kind of city are we referring. And so therefore I'm very grateful that you have laid out and sketched out here on the paper, because I would like to connect here from where we're talking now to the panel we had yesterday, War in the City, and we were talking about incarceration. So is the system of incarceration, is that a form of urbanization as well? So what would it mean to decolonize a neoliberal city? To which kind of city do we have to sing? I mean, is it a Western metropolis? From the imagination, do we need to decolonize that imagination of the neoliberal city? Or do we need to resync the urban imagery of the city in the zone of non-being? And what kind of city would it be? And is it the terms of incarceration we're talking about, like the prison industrial complex in the United States, or refugee camps and other forms of incarceration, you know, from Europe? So that's a kind of very concrete question, but I think if we have that imperative of decolonize the neoliberal city, we have to be very critical of what do we imply on the city. And so I would like to ask you both what you would suggest could be the city. I would say it's like kind of the city in the zone of non-being, or how we could articulate it. Yes.
Okay. Well, I think that first of all, we have to ask what do we mean by neoliberalism? What is neoliberal? Well, my first response is perhaps this term. I used it once. I didn't kind of talk too much about it, although it's on the title of the session here. I think it's not a term that is adequate to address all of the important realities that we just listed, that are going on in the contemporary city. But let me, having said that, let me kind of offer a couple of thoughts on what the concept is, and how at least a few things that I attempted to talk about may be understood in those terms. Normally, neoliberalism is understood to be some kind of economic ideology that advocates free markets and certain kind of scaling back or restructuring of the state. And I have always been a little bit uncomfortable with this way of understanding neoliberalism purely as an economic ideology, that can be traced to people like Friedrich Hayek. so on. Because, and also on the, also because, you know, neoliberalism is normally it's in the kind of the Washington consensus, you know, the World Bank kinds of, you know, popular versions of it, is understood to be, you know, the expansion of the free market and the contraction or the restriction of the state. But in the real world, I think things never work that way. You know, neoliberalism is, I think, wherever it has been imposed as a political, economic, and an ideological project, you know, states have been fundamentally instrumental, you know, in implementing various kinds of neoliberalism around the world. And so I don't think it, and at the scale of the urban, you know, various city governments, urban regimes, have also been actively promoting and implementing this. So it's a political project as much as an economic ideology. You know, and there's a way in which, you know, a couple of things that I mentioned in my talk, you know, particularly this, you know, for urban planning kinds of, you know, people engaging in urban politics today, in particularly like North American cities, but also European cities. You know, one of the things that we have to deal with is this so-called ideology of the creative class, you know, this notion of the creative city, right? And I think there is a concept that, you know, that works very well in some ways, you know, with a certain kind of, you know, neoliberal practice, urban practice. And it is also, the creative city kind of ideology is also very capable of co-opting a lot of identity politics, multiculturalism, and so on, and kind of politicizing these kinds of, you know, identity politics and marketing them, right? Using them to market, you know, urban space, commodify space and culture. So the creative, so there is a kind of a phenomenon that is that certainly concerns me a lot, certainly in Toronto, and you know the redevelopment of that public housing project, Regent Park, like that I showed you in a few pictures, is a great example of this kind of thinking. You know, so we have right in the middle of, you know, very close to downtown Toronto, this public housing project, you know, that is there from the 50s onwards, and you know, in the, you know, from the 1917 onwards, you know, it became primarily a space of, you know, immigrant people living in Toronto, and you know, in the neoliberal times, you know, 80s and 90s, you know, the funding for housing was cut, you know, and it kind of, you know, it was not properly maintained, and so on, and it became a kind of a difficult space to live. And so it was allowed to degenerate in some ways, in a critical sense, and as well as a social sense. And then, you know, all of a sudden, you know, developers and the city planning regime came up with this great idea. You know, this is a kind of a place with low incomes, crime, poverty, and all the rest of it. You know, why don't we try to make it more interesting? Actually, make it diverse and a little bit more multicultural, even. And by bringing, like, you know, so that language of diversity was used in a very, you know, neoliberal, you know, commodifying kind of way. You know, so diversity was introduced by, and basically it meant that, you know, the whole place was bulldozed and redeveloped in a way that allowed, you know, high-income professional kinds of people, you know, so-called creative class, you know, who actually love diversity and, you know, like, you know, immigrants, color, you know, food festivals, you know, they love all this, you know, and they came and kind of now actually occupy, you know, that space. So, so in these kinds of, you know, concrete examples that practices that happen in urban planning, I think we can see how, you know, the practices of neoliberalism actually articulate with certain kinds of, you know, colonization, right? Where we really need to begin to think about, you know, what we call the decolonial kind of a critique. And I fully agree with you that, you know, this kind of up in the mainstream kind of political economic kind of Marxism here. There's some work done, but there's a long way to go. Right? And some of these people are my friends that you mentioned, like Neil Smith and David Harvey also I know, actually from my time in early 3 years ago, we shared here for a semester at the same time. And I've learned a great deal, of course, from these people, Harvey, Neil Smith, and this kind of tradition. But I think as a whole, what Andy Merrifield calls, metro-Marxism, this tradition needs to engage, the problem of colonization in a more serious way. And this is one point that I was trying to make in my mind. So I'll leave that.
Yeah, I think that, I think you make a great point of decentering the concept of neoliberalism. Because in fact, I think what we need to look at is the continuities within the discontinuities. You see, as a decolonial methodology. That is, instead of looking at chart moments like this and talking about full discontinuity in absolutist ways, we need to think about the continuities within the discontinuities to keep track of the long durée of the coloniality of power. That is, all those hierarchies are mentioned at a global scale, how these hierarchies put in place in 1492 at a global scale in this new system that emerged after 1492, they have been over time shifting and transforming, etc., without having disappeared. Okay, still they are with us, even though colonial administrations are over in most of the world. Okay, in most of the world, even though colonialism has disappeared in most of the world, except places like Palestine, places like indigenous territories in the Americas, aboriginal territories in Asia, etc. In most of the world, the colonial administrations kind of were destroyed by the anti-colonial movements, national liberation movement in the 20th century. But the problem is that coloniality was not destroyed. That is, the power hierarchies put in place along those centuries of European colonial expansion were left intact. Okay, so we still have the epistemologies of colonial times. We still have the Christian patriarchy. We still have the division of labor, the class exploitation, the accumulation, expanded accumulation in English in the zone of being, this accumulation by dispossession in the zone of non-being, and that continues. What we need to see then in neoliberalism is a new regime, okay, within those continuities, and see what effects neoliberalism has produced in all those hierarchies of power I have been talking about. And what happened is that, in a sense, neoliberalism has completely aggravated many things, okay, in many parts of the world. Because what neoliberalism have done is, in a more overt way than what they were doing before, is a transferring of resources from the state to transnational corporations, private corporations. That's what they're doing. And basically, they're calling for states handoff, handoff of the economy, this is the ideology. The state should not intervene, etc. But at the same time, the state is constantly intervening by transferring wealth, okay, from the state, taxpayers' money, etc., into private corporations. So they're privatizing everything. In doing that, the process of dispossession that have been there for 500 years become worse for people of color. Because now, whatever was there, minimum things there to survive, to rely on, to grapple, they're not there anymore, okay? Because now they have privatized everything, you see? So the neoliberal city is a process of dispossession, the aggravation of the process of accumulation by dispossession in the zone of non-being. And therefore, I would say that we need to look at the neoliberal regime within those long-term continuities of the power hierarchies I mentioned and see how this regime have aggravated what was there already, you know, and instead of centering, like you said, instead of centering neoliberalism as the central concept, we need to decenter it and center the analysis on the cartography of power of the multiple hierarchies I've been talking about of the capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modern colonial world system. Okay? To be able then to look at how different regimes over time have been articulating this cartography of power. The latest, in the last 500 years, the latest is the neoliberal regime, aggravating everything that was there before. And now you have also dispossession within Europe of mass number of people of the south of Europe and the east of Europe, going back to normal, because that was always the case, of the south and east of Europe. They were always in a colonial condition relative to the western, northwestern Europe. To the point that, I don't know how much you guys, you probably know better than me this, but you know that in the south of Europe today, the economies are collapsing, and they're collapsing not because they're lazy, like you see here in the German press or in the northern press, that these are people are lazy, these people are throwing, they're corrupt, they're this, they're that, as if there was no corruption here, okay? The difference is that now you have a process through the neoliberal regime of accumulation by dispossession, now extended once again, and I'm saying once again, we will always have that with the south of Europe, once the northwest Europe became the center of this European center system, that now you see in the south of Europe similar thing. And you know that the central bank of Europe, controlled by German capital and German political elites, are constantly impeding the bank from transferring wealth to the south. Okay, and keep asking for more cuts, more austerity, more devastation, more dispossession, okay, in the south of Europe, without sending a penny. Merkel always impeding that the bank, Central Bank of Europe, will pass money over there. Even though the Central Bank of Europe, we know, is a construction that is supposed to serve all the economies within this territory. But the old division of North Europe, South Europe is back with the force, okay? There was a period of like maybe 10 years, 15 years, where the south of Europe was living this dream of thinking now that they're finally Europeans. Now they're discovering that that was just an illusion, okay? That they've been always subalternized, okay? They've been always subalternized for several centuries. At one point in time, in the 16th century, they were the center and the formation of the European colonial expansion. But that was over with the Dutch taking over in the mid-17th century and with the Treaty of Westphalia. Since then, South of Europe was subalternized, okay? To the point that the famous Immanuel Kant was saying that rationality was north of the Pyrenees Mountains. Remember that? Immanuel Kant, he was saying rationality is north of the Pyrenees Mountains. Meaning by that, he said very early, that in the south of the Pyrenees, Spain, Portugal, Italy, all those places too much contaminated by black, Islam, Arabs, and weird things, and so they are in the zone of non-being, they're in the realm of irrationality. Rationality modernity is north of the Pyrenees Mountain. That was said by the famous Immanuel Kant, a super racist philosopher, okay, together with Hegel, okay. But that is coming back with the force, because it was like that until in the mid-80s, early 90s, when these countries entered into the European community, European Union, and now, 15, 20 years later, they are now back where they were already for a long time. And this is what is going on. And now the north of Europe, again, exercising a coloniality of power over the south of Europe. And let me tell you, down there, there is strong movements and mobilization going on, and you'll be surprised about what is coming. Just this Tuesday, in Spain, there are millions of people going to take over the Congress, the Palace of Congress in Madrid, just this Tuesday. Okay? And they're there calling for the resignation of the whole government and for a new constitution, because they're saying this is not democracy. Cannot be a democracy in which a few political elites decide for the people how much money goes to the banks and how much money is taken away from the people. That's over for the majority of Spanish people. People are in the streets.
I would like to open the floor to the audience. And perhaps we raise, we have one. So perhaps we put two questions together.
Okay, I'd like to thank both the panelists for their talks, and I would be interested to know whether the first talk could be made available in writing, because
available in writing?
Yeah, because
Sure.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Because I didn't get all of the names. Two quick questions. One is maybe more to the first talk. When you talked about the goings on in this part of town of Toronto, I was interested, and also you talked about the comparative research that you did, Paris and Toronto. I was interested in hearing a bit more about the agency of the people that is faced with this violence. And when I say agency, I'm interested in resistance, but not only. I'm also very much interested in the sociality that they organize in these urban spaces beyond the mere idea of reacting to this onslaught, and especially also with regard to how this also has reshaped the space, or how they have managed to create a space governed by their own sociality before it was then taken over. And the question then is also maybe what could be learned or gleaned from these practices. And then a question maybe for both of you. Ramón, we just talked about the dynamics in Southern Europe. A few days ago I was comparing mental notes with a Nigerian friend of mine, and we were talking about how these things that we see meted out on Greece and other southern countries is the exact same, or I would even say a mild version of what my family in Ghana and my friend's family in Nigeria have been living in the 80s, when structural adjustment clamped down on the state and public services there. And while I do get the comparison, I'm also thinking that there's of course a difference in that, as you talked about zone of being and non-being, of course, racial hierarchies also play into that. And of course, I mean, our relatives in West Africa were already at the bottom of a hierarchy, whereas here, as people are being reduced in this neoliberal agenda, they still have this symbolic capital, racist capital. So I would be interested if both of you could also speak to the way in which this moment of increased austerity also, brings back these dynamics and how they play out in, your fields of research. Thank you.
I would suggest, because now we have those two questions, we answer, and then we see that.
Okay, I agree with you. The thing is that we need to do this global to the local as a nested hierarchy, okay, where, for example, the south of Europe in relation to Latin America, Africa, and other countries is in the zone of being, okay, and Spain has a lot of investments, for example, in Spain. Portugal has investments in Africa, etc. So you have, they are a kind of a core power in relation to peripheral economies. In the global south, they are, in a sense, in a zone of being relative to other zones of non-being. But within Europe, then you have another layer, which is that within Europe, there's zones of being non-being. Okay? And in a sense, what is happening with this financial crisis here, which is not a world financial crisis, that's another lie that we're reading everywhere. It's not true that there is a crisis in the rest of the world, okay? The crisis is fundamentally a European and American crisis, okay? In the rest of the world, the economies are booming. But anyway, that's another conversation. The point is that there is this layer in which you have zones of being, not being in a nested hierarchical way. That is where you have, in relation of North to South Europe is more and more populations are being dispossessed and pushed into the zone of non-being relative to the north of Europe, you see? But within Spain today, you see also zone of being, non-being, okay, where you have African labor coming there, you know, and they are in the zone of non-being relative to the Spaniard white person, okay? But then you have Spaniard white persons inside Spain, such as Andalusians, for example, that in the eyes of other regions of Spain are in the zone of non-being, you see? And then in the eyes of Northern Europe, the whole of Spain is a space of lazy people. There is a crisis there, because these people don't work, these people is just always partying, you know, always throwing money away, they're corrupt, okay? This is the image you get in the north. That's a racialized image that have a long durée within European history. But see, you need to look at all these layers in complex ways, the complexities, you know, of all these things, you know, because look at here in Germany. And again, this is why I found very useful the Fanonian concept of racism also, because I find that here, in Fanon's notion, what defines racism is an institutional power hierarchy of superiority and inferiority along the line of the human. How do you mark superiority and inferiority? Okay? Could be through color, could be through religion, could be through accent, ethnic identity, national identity. There are many ways of marking that. Okay? And there are many layers. Okay? One person could be racialized here, and that same person could be the one racializing someone else down. You see? And so these things are very complex, and in that sense, what I like here is that it allows you to think about different forms of marking racial hierarchies that are not only color or religion, or it could be a multiplicity of ways of marking it. Look at Islamophobia today in Europe. That's racism. Islamophobia is a marker of superiority and inferiority along the line of the human in Europe today. Even though what we are accustomed to think about racism in terms of only color or only biological constitution, we need to understand that there are multiple ways of marking this. And color has been a fundamental one, okay, because of the history of slavery, because of the history of the oppression of Africans in the Americas, etc. You know, and this color racism is strong and still alive. It's not haven't disappeared. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying there are other forms that coexist, that are entangled, are overlapping, it becomes very complex. You see, and we need to understand that there's not a racism. There are racisms in plural, and in that sense, for example, Polish domestic labor here in Berlin. Okay, if you watch the narrative, like the presentation of Manuela yesterday, it's a long durée of racial representation of Polish people in Germany. Look at the writings of Weber that Manuela was talking about. That still goes on today. And today, Polish women, domestic labor here in Berlin, are a racialized labor, despite the fact that they might be blue eyes, blonde hair, white skin. Okay? But it's a racialized labor because they enter in the zone of non-being relative to zone of being, you see, and they are pushed, you see, as an inferior beings inside, and then you have the entanglement of gender, racial, class oppression there in a complex way. So you cannot get confused by the way racism is marked in certain areas of the world might not be the same in others, you see. And here, for example, Polish domestic labor women, domestic labor, I would call them racialized labor here, okay, in this context, given the long history that exists between Germany and Poland in relation to Germany being an imperial power relative to Eastern Europe, racializing people in that zone of the world for a long time. The work of Manuela was very, I think, important yesterday to show that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to answer your first question very briefly. You know, unfortunately, I don't have a uplifting story to tell from Toronto, right, about some of the things that I mentioned, because particularly because this so-called creative city ideology, the creative class kind of discourse, is actually quite hegemonic, in the city. And to complicate matters even more, we now have like a kind of a populist mayor, right, and a city government, which kind of co-opted a lot of actually existing discontent in the city on the particularly on the parts of immigrant and low-income people, but kind of but he was in a kind of a populist discourse. He was able to kind of turn that around, into a austerity agenda as well. Like, so we have the worst of all possible worlds right now in Toronto, which is like a combination of creative class ideology and politics of austerity. So the two groups that I mentioned in the Toronto context, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty and No One is Illegal, these are actually not broad social movements. These are relatively small groups, very dedicated and hardworking activists. So they are they stage various kinds of actions, interventions in the city, but I would not yet anyway refer to their activism as anything like a social movement or like a right to the city broad-based kind of urban political movement, right? I would like to say that is the case, but it is not as a movement, and and I can't unfortunately also speak much about Paris because we do this comparative study, but my partner is the one who really knows the Paris case, so I won't say much about that. But if you want an uplifting story from Canada, I can talk to you afterwards. It is actually about it will be about the actions of the students in Quebec.
Yeah, we won.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have some more questions? I see here, over there, here.
So one quick comment and then a question to Ramón. I hope you don't mind me addressing you with your question. The difference, another difference between the Southern European labor and say people in West Africa is that you have a completely different kind of mobility possible for Southern Europeans into Northern Europe that you do not have from the global South into the global North. You have undocumented labor, which is then criminalized. My question is perhaps a slightly facile one, but it has to do with decolonizing knowledge. You said that there are critical traditions of Marxism and and other critical traditions from non-Western traditions that we should engage with. My question would be, when it comes to dealing with Western theorists, Western philosophers such as Hegel and Kant, can we separate their philosophies that weren't necessarily racist in their form from their other latent Orientalist and racist conceptions? So like Marx's latent Orientalism that was talked about yesterday, Hegel's racism that was mentioned by you today.
Yes, I think that, yes, you could decolonize those authors and try to save their insights. You see, you could do that, but you will have to entail a process of decolonizing them from their own Orientalist, racist, theories. Because, for example, when Kant spoke about the transcendental subject, okay, I'm sorry to say, but he was not talking about probably 95% of the people in this room, okay? But then you read them and you say, oh, the transcendental subject, no? Oh, that's me. It's talking about me, no? It's not talking about most of you, okay? Because it was very clear at the time that the transcendental rationality, the transcendental subject, was a white male from north of the Pyrenees mountain. Women, Western and Western, were all out, okay? Non-Western people were all out. He would say straightforward, the yellow people, the black people, and the red people. He used those terms. These people have no rationality. Okay, they are in the zone of non-being, below the line of the human. I mean, read his anthropological writings. It's very clear there, you know? Or if you read Hegel, for him the spirit went from east to west. Okay? And the east stayed in a childish stage of the development of the spirit. It's the west, European civilization, that is the maturity of the development of the spirit. That's why he thought of himself as the philosopher of the end of history. He thought that the climax of human civilization was European civilization. He thought, this is the end of history, and I am the philosopher of the end of history. And he has the God-I view. That's why he can talk about absolute knowledge, because he reconstructs the knowledge of all knowledge. Because now he's looking at history from a God-I view, from the end of history. You see, there's nothing new will come after, because we have achieved the climax. You see? But the spirit for him never passed through Africa nor through the indigenous people in the Americas or Aboriginal people in Asia. The spirit never passed over there. You see? And if you take those authors, or in Marx, look at his concept of despotic Orientalism as a mode of production to talk about Asian people and indigenous people in the Americas. That's why he ended up supporting the British invasion of India and the American invasion of Mexico. You see, under the idea that Western civilization, as a good Hegelian, no? Western civilization is superior, and the only way we can take all these primitive people away from their barbarianism is through an imperialist Western invasion that will take them into the capitalist system and then create a proletariat that will then be able to move forward in the line of history. You see, that what history is that? I'm sorry, that's a European, Eurocentric history. And that was super racist, but that doesn't mean that you can not have good things from Marx, you see, and do a decolonial reading of Marx, take the best of him and throw away all those things that do not work, you see. I'm not an anti-European fundamentalist, okay? I am calling for epistemic diversity, okay? Many people, when you question this, because Eurocentric fundamentalism is so ingrained, so normalized, so commonsensical that we don't call it a fundamentalism, you see? The fact that we only read European males of 5 countries, okay, in the social science, we call that social science. More provincial like that, you cannot have it, okay? But they call it universal theory, you see? And the problem is that from those theories, you're supposed to know the rest of the world, okay? And then you have you could use some of the insights of these theories, but you need to bring epistemic diversity, you see? And the fact that I'm calling for epistemic diversity doesn't mean that I'm denying the good contributions that could come from European thinkers, even those same male European thinkers, okay? I'm not denying that. They are the ones denying the contributions of the rest of the world. You see? But then you talk like this, and immediately people are saying this might be an anti-European fundamentalist. You see? This guy is anti-European. No, I'm not anti-European. This tradition of thought that is a Eurocentric, male tradition of thought, okay? Western male tradition of thought, they are the ones that are epistemic, racist, and sexist. They are the ones that are excluding all the other epistemologies. Okay? They're the ones that do not want to hear about the experience of women, be that Western, non-Western, or the experience of non-Western males. The knowledge production of all of this is completely invisibilized, silenced, inferiorized. That's why I call it a form of racism, epistemic racism. And I put /sexism, because it's about privileging a Western male of 5 countries. If you examine carefully, these 5 countries I mentioned is 12% of humanity. So imagine the pretension. The social historical experience, 12% of humanity is supposed to give you the critical theory, scientific theory to understand the rest of the world. Okay? It's worse. is 6%, because it's only the males of this context. Okay, so 6% of the social historic experience of the world is supposed to give you, that's super provincial. But if you go to a university here and you say this is provincial, they will look at you like as if you are some kind of Islamic fundamentalist or some kind of indigenous fundamentalist or something like that, you know? Just calling for epistemic diversity in the canon of thinking, just calling for that, that's enough to, you know, crucify you. Anyway.
Okay, briefly. I guess, you know, there's not much to add, you know, but briefly, I mean, you can, I suppose, ask the same question about Heidegger. You know, like, is there anything to take out of Heidegger in spite of his, you know, association with National Socialism or fascism? It's a complex question to, you know, deal with, you know, a few sentences, but maybe you can, you know, and certainly, my short answer to your question is yes, you know, and but let me add just this, you know, there is you know, there is no such thing as a good colonialism and a bad colonialism. It is only bad colonialism. But there is such a thing as a good Marxism and a bad Marxism. And so, like, you know, in our work, you know, we do take seriously the work of people, both, you know, in the West and not, you know, outside the West, who have used, you know, Marx in useful and, you know, intelligent and productive ways. And, you know, like we were, I mean, expected Angela Davis at some point to actually be physically present here, but she wouldn't come. Now, it's a great example of somebody who engaged, you know, not only Marxism, but also, you know, Frankfurt's critical theory in the most rigorous philosophical sense you can imagine. You know, she was a serious student of, you know, Ramón and Herbert Marcuse. And if you read some of her writings, like on not class, but, you know, I'll give you a specific example. You know, look at the Angela Davis reader and read there's an interview at the end where she actually, in an autobiographical kind of way, recounts the relationship with Adorno and Marcuse. But also there's an essay in that book, I can't remember the title exactly, but it is about you know, long before the word sectionality became kind of fashionable, because, you know, trying to think about Marxism and feminism together. So in this essay, she conducts a very rigorous, you know, close reading of Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts from 1844 and draws lessons from that for radical socialist, humanist, feminism, right? So, and she has gone on to do other works, and I'm just giving you one example, you know, Angela Davis. But, you know, in the Canadian context, I have really mentioned my good friend and, you know, I'm fortunate to be her neighbor as well, the Marxist, anti-racist, feminist critic, Himani Banerjee, who's, you know, communist from Bengal, but for a long time, anti-racist, feminist activist in Toronto. You know, I mean, these people know how to read Marx. So I mean, at some moments in our you know, joint talk, let's say, I felt like you know, you started by saying you agree with a lot of things I say, and I agree with a lot of things you say, but maybe we have slightly different languages, and I threw a few Marxist names around. And I felt like, you know, in spite of the initial declaration of agreement, you know, you were sometimes looking at me like I'm personally responsible for all the faults of That's a joke. But
didn't see you up.
But I think the basically, like, to put it in a philosophical way, you can say that you know, it is not possible to be Marxist. You know, being is a metaphysical category. You know, that is not like even if you read Heidegger, you can't be a Marxist. You can only do Marxism. And it depends on how you do it.
Not at all. On the contrary, I saw your talk as very similar to mine. That's why I began my talk by saying that we're saying the same thing with different languages. That's it. You know, when you say colonization, I say coloniality, but we're talking about the same thing. You know, and I said at the beginning of my talk that decolonization had to be pluriversal, cannot be universal. It had to be a multiple epistemic perspectives and locations, and it cannot be again one language, one epistemology, one experience, now becoming the language of decolonization with a, you know, with a capital D. Because then we reproduce once again the Western-centric tradition, okay, where you have now Western male deciding what is good for you, okay, but now you have it from some subaltern position saying this is the way to decolonize. There's no way to say that because the colonial experience, imperial history, local histories, epistemic perspective is so diverse in the world that we cannot pretend to talk about decolonization as if it was a one single project or a project that is universal in the sense of one defining for the rest. It has to be pluriversal in the sense of multiple inter-epistemic dialogues, okay, and from different perspectives. And therefore, the strategy of decolonization in one part of the world cannot be the same in other parts. I mean, we need to acknowledge that.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for this talk. I think we have to wrap up now because we're already ahead with the time. And because we started, because before we go into the program, first of all, I would like to ask for a big applause to this wonderful talk.